My name's Helena Herklotz. I'm chairing your session today, and this is the developments in care session. So if this isn't the one you chose, you've got a few seconds now to leap out and go to the session that you chose. We've got 3 presentations today, and we're going to hear each in turn, after which we'll have 3 or 4 minutes for questions, and then hopefully a little bit of time for questions and discussion at the end. All the presentations, I think, are in your delegate pack, so you don't need to kind of write down all the slides. You'll be able to use those as reference today and after the conference. We're going to be videoing and recording the session, and it's hoped that the video will be available online afterwards. So just a note also to speakers, if you can stand roughly where I am, because that means that your voice will be recorded and that the camera will record you as well. So try not to, although I know you're going to be excited and wanting to move your arms and move around, try and keep within roughly this area will be really helpful. Just in terms of running order, in a moment I'm going to ask Dr. Mary Larkin from Open University to kick off the session, and then Dr. John Willem and Nicole Steels from King's College London, and then finally Madeleine Naik from University of Kent, who will be talking around telecare and the third sector. Some really interesting research areas for us to discuss. Just a couple of housekeeping things from me. If you don't mind putting your mobile phones onto silent or vibrate or something that doesn't have a phone ring. And also, if you do have questions, if you can try and make those as brief as possible during the question session, just so we can get in as many as possible on that. So, without further ado, can I ask Mary to come up and to introduce a session on carer research and the knowledge scoping review. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Helena. This presentation is based on a project funded by the SSCR entitled Utilising Care-Related Research and Knowledge, a Scoping Review and Information Resource. So you can see why I didn't use that long title for this presentation. But that's what it's based on. This project's been carried out in partnership with Social Care Institute for Excellence. And just a bit of background before I tell you more about the project. There's now a wealth of national and international literature around and research around carers, but it's all over the place. It hasn't got a natural home, and it lacks accessibility and utility as a result. And that in turn makes finding information about carer research difficult, and it impedes its capacity to reliably inform future research. And we touched on that in the panel discussion just now about the fact there's a lot of duplication, and so we were concerned about those sorts of issues. And this project aims to make a significant contribution to addressing this deficit. And central to the project is a scoping review, a unique and comprehensive scoping review of care-related knowledge and research. So in this presentation, I wanted to just tell you a bit about the methodology and then how we mapped the territory, the sort of themes and issues that arose, some of the key messages, and there were lots of key messages, but I've selected ones that I think would be interesting to this audience. Draw out some of the implications for policy, for research, and tell you about some of the next steps that we've got planned. So in terms of methodology, we used ARCSI and O'Malley's 2005 framework as a guide, very much as a guide. And throughout the project, we benefited from our project advisory group. We used their expertise individually and collectively. We had meetings as well. And on that project advisory group, we had carers, people who use services. We had representatives from Carers UK, representatives from Department of Health, had a GP and social work practitioners. Our approach to the scoping was deliberately wide, and it proved to be iterative and developmental. And given the breadth of the body of knowledge and research that we were looking at, sometimes it felt a bit like going up a mountain, but we got there in the end. We refined our inclusion and exclusion criteria in the initial stages, and in the end we focused on material that was published since 2000, because we found much of the older material had lost its relevance. or had been superseded. We focused on literature that was available in the English language, and we focused on the care of adults. And the searches we did were undertaken between June and December 2016, and these focused on 10 electronic databases supplemented by web searches. We found that using multiple databases became counterproductive in the end. And all the materials that we found and identified were captured and saved on the EndNote data management software. So, turning to mapping the territory, in the end, we found 3,535 references. And as this next slide shows, the databases varied, well, they varied full stop, but they varied in terms of their productivity. So here you can see that the most productive database was Social Care Online. 31% of our items came from that. And we classified the materials into 17 types. And you can see from this slide here that here's the 17 types, but journal articles were by far the most common category, accounting for 70% of the citations. The second highest was were those coded as magazine articles, which we classified as other articles, particularly those identified in the professional and trade press. And government documents came in as the third highest category. And obviously we weren't trying to establish a hierarchy, we're just reporting on what we found. So turning to themes and issues, we coded the resources and categorised them into 62 themes. These are shown in colour on this slide here. I don't think the colours come out on the slides that are in the conference pack. So we've got in green, carer variables, in yellow, a type of care, in blue, impact of care, and in red, support for carers. And we defined those categories, how we were approaching them there on this slide. And as you can see, the biggest category was impact of care, and the smallest category was support for carers, only 16%. And we also defined the themes within each category. This is just to give you an example of support for carers, how you can see we defined what we meant by assessment, we defined what we meant by care act evaluation. So it's transparent actually how we're approaching the scoping review. And there was obviously some blurring between categories and themes, but this was as definitive as we could get it. And we analysed also the highest and lowest frequency of themes. And I've rather than give you the whole lot, I've set them out here. And you can see the highest occurring theme was carers and health at nearly 2,000 citations. And the lowest was post-caring, what happens after caring has ceased. And was it caring at a distance was very low too. But charting the frequency of the themes gave us an overview of the parameters of the research and knowledge that we've got at the moment. It also helped us to see where we got a lot of research, where we haven't got so much, and perhaps it's needed. It also highlighted where future analysis ought to be directed, and highlighted a lot of major issues and questions still to be answered. Now, full details of the scoping review will soon be available in a report. It's going to be finished this week, and it's a pretty weighty tome. But for the purposes today, I chose a few key messages and issues that, as I said at the beginning, I thought would be of interest particularly to this audience. And I've put them on one slide, so I apologise for the busyness of this slide, but I just wanted to make sure I got them all on the same slide. So the first point is that the key issue that came out was that carers and caring are extremely diverse, involves all sections and all age groups of populations, and people are increasingly likely to experience one or more caring episodes in their lives. Whilst there's a lot of similarities in the experience of carers, at the same time it has to be recognised that all caring is unique. And connected with that point is that all care takes place in a relationship, and every relationship is different. We've often talked about the dyadic relationship in caring. And attention to both parties in that dyadic relationship is vital in understanding where interests coincide and where they diverge. Interestingly, we're still short of knowledge about hard-to-reach groups, particularly BME carers and LGBT groups. And whilst the profile and research around young carers has grown considerably in recent years, they still only remain a fairly small proportion of the total carer population. Another interesting point is that most care is provided for older people, and typically by adult children or a spouse or a partner. Older carers still remain fairly invisible in policy, practice and research, and as I'm sure many of you know, are less likely to identify themselves because of the context of the relationship, of the caring relationship and in which they're operating. There's newly emerging material about sandwich care generation, adult children carers, child carers, providing intensive support for an older a parent, and they're typically themselves aged under 65 and juggling the demands of work and caring. And we found that a third of women aged 55 to 69 are providing care to both a younger generation and an older generation, partly because younger generations come back and live at home for longer now because of the housing situations and so on. An area that attracts a lot of attention is the mental health of carers. And there's tended to be what has been referred to as a burden of care discourse. But this fails to acknowledge the benefits and the intrinsic satisfaction that a lot of carers do experience at the same time, as well as experience burden. How carers cope and how they can be taught appropriate coping strategies is also attracting more attention now. And the results seem to be quite promising in terms of improved well-being for carers, although the impact on the people being supported isn't quite as clear or as evident yet. There's increasing attention being paid to balancing the demands of working and caring and supporting carers to remain in employment, and that's a recurrent policy theme too. But as we know, this is a complex territory because policies that develop don't necessarily help those in less skilled jobs. They're more supportive of people in management and professional roles. And last but not least, penultimate one, evidence about the effectiveness of services is sometimes equivocal and sometimes contradictory too. For example, the evidence about the effectiveness of respite care, but what did come out is that carers do benefit from breaks from carers. And also psychosocial interventions appear to have the best evidence of making a difference for some carers, particularly those who are caring for someone with dementia or someone who's had a stroke. And lastly, what came through, a message that came through as well, was that support has to be tailored. And sometimes it's not the process, sometimes it's the process of the support and interventions that may be valued more than the end outcome, even if the end outcome doesn't indicate any positive effects. It's the actual process of going through that. So that's some of the key messages. As I say, there's much more detail in the report itself. In terms of implications for policy, the existing knowledge is able to identify critical points and identify groups of carers who are likely to be under particular strain and pressure and where attention should be prioritised. And another implication for policy is that building carers' resilience and enabling them to develop strategies to manage stress and pressure they experience appears to be an important area to develop further. Implications for research. It was clear that knowledge about carers' lived experiences should be maintained and extended. it's crucial to address the deficits in existing knowledge and to direct attention towards expanding the evidence base too. And we found that there was evidence that evaluation of pilot programmes for interventions need to be more rigorously designed, perhaps with, where possible, comparisons with a control group, perhaps a treatment as usual group, to introduce rigour into them. And finally, more longitudinal data is needed. Often studies are from cross-sectional evidence. There's long been recognised that there's a need to examine the impact of caring in the long term and after caring and over the course of the life course, with more of us caring more than once in our lives. And to do that, we need longitudinal data. And at the moment, there's a lack of longitudinal data. So that's a summary of what we found. I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the next steps, because this is crucial to the impact of the study. So the scoping review for the first time has presented a detailed and academically robust mapping of care-related research and knowledge. And in that process, highlighted various issues and questions for researchers, policymakers and practitioners. We're going to be disseminating it soon, once it's being published, through as many channels as we can disseminate it through, so that it can contribute to the identification of future research priorities and also support improvement and the evidence-based nature of social care practice and policy with carers and those they support. And in connection with that last point, I've managed to secure higher education infrastructure funding, which is unique to universities, because I'm based at the Open University. But I've got funding to now transform this scoping review into a digital resource that will be freely accessible. It'll be based on the OU intranet site, but all national and international stakeholders will be able to get at that review and be able to do a search on it. My next stage is to secure funding to get it regularly updated and to introduce more interactive features on it. So that's what I'm looking for funding for next. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this project was done in partnership with Sky, and we were working with them all the way through, and we had a member of Sky on our project advisory group as well. And they are using some of the study to underpin a new hub around carers on their website. And this will be for anyone who is commissions or delivers care or social care work. The launch date is June 2017. On this slide here, I put an outline of the thinking about it as it is at the moment. We've still got to come up with a title. Discussions are ongoing at the moment. But this gives you an impression of what we're thinking about. It'll be mapped to Google search terms and optimised accordingly to ensure that its findability is maximised. So it should have a good throughput of users. It'll have it'll provide access to the original scoping review, a downloadable printable version, and they're going to link it to the OU site when it's set up. That's happening at the moment. There'll be additional materials to and selected findings and themes from the scoping review. We're still working on those. And it'll also have access to other Sky work around the Care Act, the work they've done around young carers, and the work they've done around carers in employment. And Sky will ensure that the dynamic pages are supported by relevant updates, and they'll continue to add relevant carer-specific work too. So these are the applications of the scoping review, and will maximise its impact on practice, policy and research. We will be exploring in the next few months other ways of contributing towards it having maximum impact too. So if anyone's got any suggestions about ways we can do that, I'd be more than happy to listen. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Mary. Really great overview, and also lots of stuff around making an impact and working with the Social Care Institute for Excellence and others. So really good to hear that. Any quick questions? So we've got one there. Yeah.
Just a quick one. David Croysdale will be wearing two hats. One is chair of the Public Health Advisory Committee, CNICE, and the other is chairing the Independent Advisory Group on Carers. Mary, thank you very much for that. I have to say, of all the things today, had there only been this event of yours, I would have found it worthwhile coming. It's really important.
Thank you.
What this has done, I think, is provide for the first time a coherent framework, the scoping review and the scoping review, and that's going to be so valuable in the future when I think of both of those hats, which is one of my question. In detail, though, one thing you haven't touched on is that so many people undertake caring activity throughout their lives at particular points, but then the caring finishes, and research doesn't really look at the bereavement factor. I don't mean bereavement in the sense of the person who is lost, but in terms of the role that's very often becomes so important in their lives. And I just wondered if that was something you'd like to comment on, because I think lots of people would be interested in that role. Certainly carers say to me this is a very neglected consideration.
Yeah, you're right. If I didn't go back, I think it was the lowest amount of research that's been done, 16, only 8 items. It's a particular interest of mine because I've done some research in this area. Maybe 2 of those items were mine. The research that exists shows there's considerable legacies of caring, post-caring, and those can be on health, psychological and physical health, financial legacies, because we talked about carers have to leave employment, they lose their social networks. So not only when caring finishes do carers have to cope with all a bereavement, but they have to cope with all that. And I personally think it's an area that needs to be looked at in much more detail. And connected also is the issue of carers the person they're caring for goes into a home as well. There's similar sort of legacies occur there. So it's going to affect more and more people, and it's also going to deplete their resources. If people have to care again, we need to look at what happens to people when they finish caring, to look at possible forms of support there, so they can care again if needed. So I think it's a really important issue. But it's hard to... The research I've done, I haven't got funding for. It's been other stuff I've done. So it's hard to get funding for that kind of... for that research. It's more focused on the immediate caring situation. Okay.
Great, thank you again, Mary, and we're going to need to move on to the next speakers. Yeah. So we're now going to have 2 inputs around telecare, first of all from John and Nicole.
Might need some help to navigate to where we need to get to. In case any of you are wondering, I'm John, that's Nicole.
Great.
Okay. Gosh, how did you manage with the screen? I can't see it. Maybe it's because I'm taller. Right. Okay. Well, that's us. We're funded by the school, and we're going to tell you about some of the findings from some work we've been doing on telecare use amongst older people in local authority settings. I get the easy job. I'm just going to tell you, set it up, and Nicole's going to present the findings, and then I'll do a kind of final slide which is sort of offering some speculative ideas about where we go next. Some of you will know about telecare, some of you won't. So this is just a quick slide to try and bring everybody up to speed. The first thing to say is that governments have, I say all governments in the 4 nations, have seen a key role for telecare for at least 2 decades. This isn't something that's new, but the actual use of telecare by local authorities is much more recent. The reason for that is that there are some formidable barriers. If you want to talk to me about the barriers afterwards, I'd be delighted to tell you about that. But they've actually prevented local authorities from really doing much more than dipping their toes in the water for a very long time. and there's been a lack of local infrastructure that would support use. That changed to some extent about 10 years ago with the Preventive Technology Grant, which gave money to local authorities to set up transformative telecare services. And with that came performance indicators, which I think were probably a bit misconceived because they encourage local authorities to pilot hire and sell it cheap and get as much telecare into people's homes as possible. And I think we're actually seeing some of the consequences of that now. And also at the time, and this is where our research comes in, I hope anyway, it commissioned the whole system demonstrator project, which some of you will have heard of. Very briefly, it was an enormous clinical trial, I think a very good study, to fill a gap in evidence about impact and effectiveness. And to everybody's surprise, I think, particularly policymakers, it found no evidence of benefit, which did create something of a policy problem, because the government's policies are still to promote the use of telecare in local authorities. And it's also true that, that there has been a renewed interest in telecare by local authorities, I think probably because of austerity, but they've seen telecare as a cost-effective way of providing help to people who need adult social care. So the local authorities have largely ignored the research evidence. And where our research comes in here, in fact, I should say a little bit more about that. Local authorities have been either indifferent or hostile to the findings of the whole system demonstrator. And we're agnostic about that. We take the view that it might be sensible, given that it was a very good study, to say, well, hang on a minute, maybe local authorities aren't getting it quite right. Let's have a look at what they're doing and see if there are ways in which we could improve the way in which telecare is deployed. So that really is the spirit of what we're trying to do. And I'll mention briefly, ADAS have been leading the charge to continue the development of telecare services, and they published their own evidence sort of data set in 2014, and their call for evidence report. Objectives and methods, this is what we're paid to do. Really look at the strategic aims of telecare, consider how local authorities are implementing those strategies for older people, and assess whether they're collecting the right evidence to determine whether that they're meeting those strategic objectives. And this is what we're really going to talk about mostly today. We carried out an online survey using SurveyMonkey software. We got 114 responses, so a 75% response rate. So I think we've got a pretty good data set. All types of council and regions that provide adult social care represented. We carried out interviews with 25 telecare leads in English local authorities. We did 4 sets of case study interviews, and we also did the online survey, as I've mentioned. And the questionnaires for all of the items we used were designed by the research team with input from advisors. I think we're now to findings, so over to Nicole.
Thank you, John. Get out of the light. Yes, I will now take the opportunity to whisk through some findings that we found, all the data that we collected, and all the themes and findings emerging from survey data, interview data, case study data. And initially, we were very interested in strategic aims, and we wanted to know why would local authorities use telecare, and what would they use to develop strategies maybe around that telecare provision for telecare users or for users of social care. And we found that 60% told us that they did not develop that strategy with health partners or indeed with the NHS. And also the Better Care Fund, which was obviously set up at that time, meaning to integrate health and social care and being a big discussion point, but that didn't seem to play a big part in developing these telecare strategies. So what was it then that they were aiming for? And we found there were 2 basic aims around telecare provision. And one was really to provide services and support for people to enable them to stay living at home. And we found from other research that people indeed want to do that. They don't really want to move into residential care. And one telecare lead told us, they said, well, under the Care Act, we want to provide the least restrictive option for older people that will still allow them to remain as independent as possible within their own home, or at least in a homely environment outside of residential care. But the other aspect, maybe unsurprisingly, was around saving money or making savings to the adult social care budget. And we heard here they said, I think our very major secondary drive is that telecare can replace more expensive human-based services where those services aren't necessary. And one example that we heard of often in these interviews was around simple night sits, and said, even if something as simple as a night sit can be replaced with a telecare package, it's basically a no-brainer to do that, because it would hopefully make savings for that local authority. So what is it that they wanted to achieve? Well, to achieve helping people to remain living at home, it was around providing services that would manage risk and would keep people safe, and it would be around supporting unpaid carers. So we heard very often that local authorities told us that the telecare we provide is not necessarily for the social care user, him or themselves, but it is actually for a family member or for a friend who looks after that person. So the support is more into the unpaid carer than the person himself. And another part around that was to say we want to provide mandates, and I'm not sure whether you can read this, but it was really around providing people with the ability to remind them and to help them around prompting to people to do. So remind people to take medications, for instance, with the use of pill dispensers and such devices. And we found there was less around maybe providing telecare devices for getting in contact with others, so social contacts, or preventing loneliness. We said that one really major aim was to make savings to the budgets. So we were interested in looking into financial commitments. And 40% in the survey said that they thought that telecare was indeed making savings to their budgets. However, they also thought that they didn't really have data on, give hard evidence to that. Some local authorities described some modeling around hypothetical savings, and they said, we used to gather some data around what services would have gone in if there wasn't a telecare project, so what hands-on services would have been provided instead. However, there is no really robust approach to this, so it's rather a gut feeling than systematic proof. I want to move on to some aspects around assessment for telecare. And you will not really be able to read that graph, I fear. But we wanted to know, what is it actually you look at if you do these assessments for telecare use? And high numbers really told us that they would look into physical capabilities of people, mental capabilities. They looked into the social support that a person would get. They looked at the physical environment. Are there risks in the home? Are there steps? Are there stairs? Could people fall? They also said that they would look around the social support that people would get. So again, we're looking at unpaid carers, and the daily routines that people had. But there is a big however. We also found that these assessments, there were situations where this assessment did not take place, and that was sometimes around some devices that were provided, and we're talking often around pendants, alarms that would just be provided. Someone would ring and say, I think I would be really helpful to have a pendant alarm, and it would be provided to them without an assessment or by assessment of need. And then we also found that that was the case around enabling hospital discharge, although in the interviews we often heard that an assessment of need would take place once the patient was at home. Very quickly we looked into whether people would get advice if they wanted to self-fund, self-purchase devices, or if they wanted to use a direct payment. And it was quite interesting to see that it was about half of local authorities said, yeah, that's on one hand possible, and another half said, yes, we provide quite extensive support here, but it wasn't always the same half. There was a huge difference if it comes to reviews, and we found that if reviews actually took place, they were often done by telephone. They were often part of a wider review of social care packages, not necessarily of the telecare part. And we also found that they often focused on whether the telecare worked, not necessarily whether the telecare met the needs that were assessed for at an earlier stage. Very quickly on training. There was training. 80% of local authorities said, yes, we train the people that do assessments around telecare. However, those were very, very often very short courses, an introductory course, one session a day, sometimes half a day. They were often provided by the manufacturers of telecare or by more senior staff, more experienced practitioners. And very often they just focused on how some devices worked, or giving you some case studies around, this is what you could use to prevent falls, although we all know that a device will not prevent a fall, or this is something you could use if someone is diagnosed with dementia. This could, for instance, help an unpaid carer. We were interested in what telecare devices were available, and it was very interesting to find that 107 out of the 114 replies we got in the survey said we get devices from up to 5 manufacturers, and the very big majority saying it's 3 to 5, and who's in the field would probably know which ones we're talking about. But on the other hand, there were quite a lot of devices available in terms of types. So we found 29 devices being mentioned when we asked, what are your top 5, basically. Although, if you want to look at that very strictly, you could say not all of them someone might categorize as telecare. On the other hand, someone could argue, maybe they made use of something that is not necessarily related to telecare, but made just use because there was a need for it. We asked telecare leads, we need 2 more minutes, whether they thought that their services were person-centered or service-driven. And I really have to whisk through that now because I've been told off. Basically, it was half and half. Half said it is really person-centered because we don't provide any standardized kits. There are no packages. We don't have a dementia package. We don't have a fall care package. But the other half said actually it's a bit of both. Because sometimes you will find that, yes, we do a very individualized assessment and we come up with individual solutions. But if you then compare them, they all basically look the same because a lot of times the conditions are just the same. And then we would give the same telecare solutions to that. And the other part of that was really over-prescribing of telecare. Assessors going in, having in mind, and we want to promote telecare, so we just give you everything, we try it out, and whatever doesn't work, we take out again. And that actually leads me to the idea of installing. So we heard that people, some local authorities had their own teams. In others, it was the manufacturer of telecare would install and maintain it. And then we also looked into whether local authorities heard a lot of, could you come please and take out some telecare? And one of the reasons given was not really, although in general, apparently there aren't high numbers around that, but if that was the case, and it wasn't around a change of need, it was really, we're not getting on with it, it's taking over our life, please remove this and that and the other. And we thought that might be due to, a lack of individualized assessment or of packages being individualized to what people needed. And the last part is around responding to telecare alarms. And we found that in over half of our responses, people said it's unpaid carers, so family members, friends, neighbors, who would be contacted first to respond to an alarm. That applied also to local authorities who would actually pay to have a mobile warden system or response service. Shire counties in general would not offer 24/7 paid response services, although for self-funders in some district that was available. Maybe you will talk about that. It would be very interesting to see. But they also said if there was no such paid response service, that some social care users would not be able to receive a telecare package due to the fact that they couldn't nominate someone. And we also heard that some people thought that it would be really important to bring family carers, unpaid carers, back into the service and cut back on paid response services. I'm going to be killed, but John would like to just have a few summarizing thoughts.
No, go ahead, but
Okay.
we'll have to
Really
roll
quick.
questions.
Okay. Right. Let's get all these up. Oops. Okay. Just to try and wrap up very quickly, I think the very brief presentation that we've done, we've got a lot more data that we could have presented, demonstrates a number of things. So some sort of speculative thoughts really to leave you with. First of all, I think it's a matter of concern that our data suggested that there was limited involvement of the NHS in telecare, local authority telecare strategies, and little use seemed to be being made of the Better Care Fund. We also question whether the strategic focus should be so much on risk management and safety. That barely scratches the surface of what telecare can do. There are questions raised about the circumstances in which it's okay to use telecare without an assessment and when it's essential. Clearly that there's some more work to be done there. We scratched the surface of the question of who should assess for telecare and what matters within the context of a telecare assessment. We also considered the issue where assessments are done, and clearly a lot of assessment activity is taking place outside of the person's home. Now I would say actually you can't really assess somebody's needs for telecare unless you see them in their home environment. And as Nicole's pointed out, reviews are often based around whether the devices are working correctly, rather than whether they're actually meeting the needs or whether there are new needs for which there might be a telecare solution. Limited range of technology available in many local authorities, as Nicole said. And also we spotted, particularly in Shire counties, a tendency, I suppose, for a shifting of responsibility from the local state onto private individuals. So that the telecare responders the first line responders were often unpaid carers, which may actually increase carer burden. I can see that telecare can help unpaid carers, but it also can create additional pressures. We wonder whether person-centred approaches to telecare can be compromised by various things, remote assessment access to a limited range of devices or the absence of a mobile response. We think there's probably a better need for training for telecare staff, particularly around assessment activity. And we also think that there's a need for information giving so that people who self-assess and use direct payments or private funding can make the right decisions around telecare. Thanks for listening. Sorry about going over.
Thanks very much, John and Nicole. A huge amount there to take in, but some really important questions at the end. I think we're going to need to move straight on, actually, to our final presentation, which will look at telecare in the third sector. So it'll be interesting to see if some of the issues we've just touched on now emerge in relation to the third sector. Madeline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Madeline Nike and I work at the Personal Social Services Research Unit at the University of Kent. That was only recently that I started working for them. Up until then, for the last 10 years, I've been working as an occupational therapist in social care and in mental health settings. I have particular interest in the practitioner experience with the use of telecare, as for the last 4 years of my practice, I was using telecare as a practitioner. This research project was actually funded by the Fellowship Award for Building Research Capacity in Adult Social Care, and this was to help me for making a transition from the practitioner to being more active in research, and this was the first personal award that I've been given. The project had a short time frame of only 8 months, as you can see, from September through to May this year, and it was an investigation of the role of specialist staff that prescribe telecare in the third sector, an analysis of their models of practice and that has been adopted by this sector. Due to the ageing population in the UK, local authorities now have to contribute towards preventing or delaying development of supporting care needs for both adults and their carers. Given the figures provided by Age UK, current care and support systems are now required to intervene early in order to support individuals, help people retain and regain their confidence and their skills, and to reduce any or delay deterioration wherever possible through preventative services. Third sector services and providers have been important in the delivery of social care for some time now, and they provide an early and timely response to people in the community to reduce further dependence on social and health care. Just briefly, for those people that perhaps are a little confused about what telecare is, as when I first started my practice, the first generation devices were the simplest form of telecare, and it was a user-triggered alarm that was either through a portable device such as a pendant or on a pull cord in someone's own home. We're now using second generation telecare systems which utilise a much broader range of sensors, which was covered by John and Nicole in their study, with sensors that detect specific hazards within the home environment and don't require the user to actually to trigger them. So given the changing landscape of the social care role has changed for the Care Navigator, they were initially set up to improve people's health and well-being for older people. The Care Navigator has now become trained telecare assessors in the last 3 or 4 years in order to meet a growing need for assessment and review and increasingly elderly and frail population to provide telecare to support people in their own home. The reason for choosing care navigators as my participants was, despite the small sample size, they are established telecare assessors and they have a wide range of referrals and meet people ranging from people with complex needs to people that have fallen through the net of services. This was a qualitative study and it gathered data from interviews. Interviews questions were based on a series of open-ended questions, and in order to understand the motivation, experiences and decision-making processes of the care navigators. It was during recruitment of the care navigators that I found that some people were no longer in post, but their network themselves led me to making new leads to take part in the study. They took place in the participants' own place of work because I was very mindful of the impact that obviously my study would have on their work and on their daily practice. And all interviews were audio recorded and transcribed for data analysis. As a novice researcher, I used a framework analysis approach. It was chosen to underpin the data analysis and help in the development of a robust qualitative method of analysis. It was felt that the sample size was small enough for all transcripts to be considered for this study in the familiarisation process of the framework analysis. This slide just sets out the process that I undertook. At the first stage of analysis, it is familiarisation. This is where I was able to immerse myself in the data through looking at the transcripts and develop a coding matrix to familiarise myself with the information given by the interviewees. It was found during identification of some of the texts that they interweaved between different codes, and this allowed me to find connections between possible themes and which could be used at a later stage of the analysis. The decision was made to use the software package Envivo as a tool to assist with my analysis, and this software helped to search for patterns in the data which enabled me to code passages of text. Following the initial stages, tentative themes could be reviewed and refined. I was able to use descriptive accounts to summarise and chart the data. When mapping and interpreting the data, I was able to move beyond the original text from the transcripts and start to interpret the data in a more conceptual way, noting emerging ideas. A total of 12 participants took part from a South East authority, from across a number of Age UK branches, voluntary agencies, housing sector and equipment provider. The managers and installers were also included to provide an organisational context and objective viewpoint to the Care Navigator practice. I hope you can see this, but this was the coding matrix that I used, and this is an example of how I used it to identify the codes and the categories. The information from transcripts on Envivo were used for me to give my preliminary thoughts and for working towards identifying initial categories at this stage. From this, the mapping and interpreting data, I was able to use the initial categories from my first coding matrix and move into more refined categories. And comparisons of themes and sub-themes were checked against the original transcripts and charts reviews to see the whole data set, identifying, therefore, the final themes and concepts. Now I've shown you my methodology, I'm going to move on to the emerging themes, as my analysis is not yet complete for my project. One of the emerging themes was responsiveness within the third sector. And looking at the examples of some of the quotes, it was about how the Care Navigator had knowledge of the products and how the Care Navigator was able to review changing needs and how the use of telecare enabled people to be connected to an immediate response. The Care Navigator also was able to give consideration for longer-term aims for people. The aims of the study was to identify current practice methods in the third sector and when prescribing telecare, which was demonstrated through my analysis, which found that that Care Navigators had dynamic working methods to meet changing needs for people. The Care Navigators' expertise were also able to provide multifaceted equipment packages. They promoted safety while retaining individuals' independence, and they felt that people were reassured by the reliability of the telecare equipment. My second theme is autonomy, and looking at the examples again, the Care Navigator was able to provide comprehensive reviews. There was a recognition of the third sector role from other organisations as well, and it identified the organisation approach of the third sector. There was significant peer support as well offered to the Care Navigator. With regards to autonomy, it identified how the third sector were perceived by others and how they managed to maintain their independent practice. The third sector is self-sufficient when it comes to telecare by providing comprehensive assessment and reviews and being encouraged to make decisions about telecare provision on their own. There is a recognition that the Care Navigator has capacity to work differently due to their assessment style actually differs from the statutory sector by having the ability to develop relationships with the people that they assess and understand their situation to meet their needs. The final theme was sustaining performance. Sustaining performance in the third sector obviously was helped by the ability to provide home visits which benefited the service delivery from the Care Navigators. The Care Navigators was also able to be involved in effective discharge planning within the hospital teams. However, the capacity of the Community Care Navigator and community-based staff was considered by Care Navigators as sometimes problematic. However, saying that, the Care Navigator obviously has a really good understanding of the products that are currently being developed and are constantly trying to keep themselves updated by this. This addresses the research aim to understand the organisational impact on prescriber practice, as it was identified that smaller organisations can provide effective care planning and service delivery when meeting discharge planning aims by an increasing involvement in integrated hospital teams. There is recognition that there is pressure on resources, though, and sometimes working with limited resources in the third sector. Community care navigators often have to step in where some hospital discharge teams are not telecare trained. The third sector appears to be able to retain staff, though, where there are changes in the organisation, despite changes in their organisation, and continues to provide stability to their telecare provision by valuing their staff and ensuring skills and expertise are kept within that organisation. So the implications for these themes for practice. It was found in the analysis that some links between the local authority and third sector were lost once there were significant key people had left their local authority role. So the sharing of relevant information between the local authority and the third sector needed to be maintained. There was some confusion over whether to remain involved for review. It differed in different areas for the care navigators. There is a role, however, to have an increased involvement in reviews, and as you can see from some of the quotes earlier, people did actually do those reviews either by telephone or going to the person's home. There is an increased pressure through higher caseloads on the third sector in areas with hospitals. So it is important to have that maintaining that role in the integrated discharge teams and increasing capacity for more funding for the third sector, for particularly in the care navigators, for resources for them. The third sector are given more support to access training to develop a knowledge of products, because at the moment training is currently being paid for out of the organisation's own budgets. And this will help them to be updated on the constantly developing world of telecare and as products are being more refined. So the next steps of my study, well, I've got to complete my analysis of the data and finish my project. I'm hoping I will be producing an end report for the School for Social Care Research and submit a manuscript for publication and a project report for all the organisations that participated. On a personal note, it's really to continue to develop my active career in research now that I've started and maintain my CPD for professional body so that I can keep my registration. To continue to work with other SSCR projects in the future as part of a team and to undertake any further training sort of development opportunities such as completing my master's. If you'd like any further information, there's my contact details. And are there any further questions?
Thank you very much indeed. So we've got a bit of time for any questions for Madeline. So there's one over there, yes?
The issue that I have been taking is that it seems to forget that both people who use services and carers are a diverse group of people. So it's almost like we've got a group of products, we go and assess people and we fit them into the products, rather than say to people, what are the issues and how can we adapt what we've got or use commercially made things to deal with the issue that you've got. You need to go shop.
Yes, no, you're right. There is a danger of providing a standardised package.
None of the research is looking at that.
Yes, I mean, mine was sort of looking obviously at the practitioner experience, but yes, in amongst that is part of it may come out as I look further into my themes, is that actually there are these standardised sort of packages that are being provided. At the moment, from some of the themes, it looks as though there's multifaceted sort of packages, like you say, addressing people's needs as they see fit. But yes, as telecare equipment becomes more refined, I'm ultimately hoping that they just won't be just home-based, but it'll be more based also at supporting people to go out into their local community as well. But John, I don't know if you've got some thoughts on
well, I
standardised.
There has been some work done on, which has a bearing on what you're saying, Jean. But going back several years, and you might remember this as an occupational therapist, but there's this trusted assessor framework which was developed years ago, which I think still today is a robust approach for matching the kind of needs, requirements and goals of individuals with the telecare that might be available for them. But I think as both presentations have tried to show, that there are other infrastructural issues that get in the way.
Yes, Margaret.
It's just a quick point. I was talking to John over lunch. I've mentioned I'm a carer already, and the technology I use is really off the shelf,
Right.
self-selected,
Yeah.
you know, like baby monitors.
Right,
if you like,
yes.
Go further. But you know, this telecare, which I have had into my home as a demonstration, but never took it up, because it's too inflexible, it's way back in relation to the technology that is moving so fast. So I think this is a problem with a lot of standardised sort of equipment,
Yeah.
that it's too far back, you know, it's not keeping up, and the wheels of car, you know, or whatever,
Yeah.
move too slowly, really, because it's very unsophisticated, really.
Yes,
in
no,
its
it.
operation on the whole.
Yes.
I don't want to say it's never useful, but
No.
it is very limited in, you know, it's, we need to somehow move it forward 10 years.
Yes, no,
Be
absolutely.
a little bit more,
Yes.
you know, flexible, as is mentioned. Really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The carer role is changing, and there are more live-in carers as well. All sorts of carers, and yes, it does need to be more refined for those specific sort of needs. There are some pieces of equipment out there that can be used in those situations, but yes, it's about knowing where to go for that, and some people are indeed, like you say, providing their own solutions. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Great, thank you very much
you.
indeed, Madeline. We've got literally a couple of minutes. If there's anyone else got any burning questions about any of the speakers, so we've got one over there. Yeah.
Quick one. I wonder if any research has been done into the role of AI and Amazon Echoes and the Google Homes of this world that support smaller people in their own homes. Just wondered if you looked at that as part of your research as well, because more and more people are getting these sort of assistive technologies that tell you when to take your tablet.
Yes, no. Well, that's not technology that was being used in the local authority that I was based on. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are systems out there. John.
Well, I edit a journal called the Journal of Enabling Technologies. And quick plug for the journal. If anybody's thinking of writing a telecare paper, we'd love to hear from you. But I guess the point in response to your question, we get a lot of papers from researchers which are very technically based. They're written by computer scientists and they're very clever, but they never translate. You know, there's very little follow through into practical application. And it's also interesting in this respect that the really big, you know, the giants of the kind of communication world, the Googles and the, you know, I mean, they've not really kind of got into this sort of market at all, which surprises me. I mean, you know, there's surely a massive market for, you know, apps that would be suitable for older people, range of bespoke technologies that you could customize. And the field is really dominated by, you know, a handful of telecare manufacturers. You know, it's always been a mystery to me why the really big electronics giants haven't really kind of jumped on the and seen the potential.
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me as the beginning too. I think there is a difference between some of what is provided through the sort of assessment process with maybe a very traditional model, and actually more people looking to find their own solutions. Including looking at kind of how technology that's out there in other areas of our lives can be adapted. And the more people using wearable tech now, I think, is going to be interesting. At Carers UK, we're doing quite a bit of work actually around promoting how technology can help caring, and sometimes the telecare word's unhelpful. We did a survey of carers, and we said, we asked the question, you know, how could telecare help you? And most carers said, I don't think telecare can help me. Then we explained what telecare was, and we got a very different answer. So I think there is something about how we communicate this and bring it away from maybe a statutory sector language into the technology language that most of us are using. And actually, certainly what we found is that it can give great peace of mind to carers, used in the right way and as a complementary kind of solution. So we've come to the end of our session. I'm sure there might be other questions and comments, and maybe the teams who presented can just stay for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to nab you. But can I thank you all, not just for attending the session today, but for coming to the conference and all your contributions. There will be another SSCR conference next spring, so do look out for that, and thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you.